This is Heat, and the conversation is just beginning. I'm reporting for USA Frontline. Tonight, a geopolitical earthquake in the Florida Straits. On Sunday, March 15th, President Donald Trump signaled that the decades-long standoff with Cuba may be reaching a sudden, dramatic conclusion. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, the president suggested a deal is imminent, or a takeover of a different nature. Trump's rhetoric has shifted from maximum pressure to a friendly takeover. But what does that actually mean for the 11 million people on the island? To understand the urgency, we have to look at the ground reality. Cuba is facing its most severe economic collapse since the 1959 revolution. The national power grid has essentially disintegrated. Nationwide blackouts now last up to 70 hours at a time, crippling public services. The crisis intensified in early 2026 after the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, which effectively cut off Cuba's primary source of subsidized oil. On Friday, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel made a rare admission. He confirmed that Havana has opened direct talks with Washington. Díaz-Canel's tone was desperate, aimed at finding solutions through dialogue as the country teeters on the edge of state failure. The numbers are staggering. Experts estimate 89% of Cubans are living in extreme poverty. For the first time, the state has requested UN aid for milk. The Cuban peso has evaporated in value, hitting a record low of over 400 to the US dollar on the informal market. To understand how we got here, we have to look back 67 years, a relationship defined by geographic proximity and ideological enmity. It began in 1959 when Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed Batista regime, leading to the nationalization of billions in American assets. In response, President Eisenhower imposed a trade embargo in 1960, a blockade that has remained in various forms for over 6 decades. The 1962 missile crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, cementing Cuba as a front line in the Cold War. There was a brief thaw under the Obama administration in 2014, with restored diplomatic ties and a visit to Havana. But those gains were largely erased during Trump's first term, which designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism once again. Now in March 2026, Trump is taking a different approach, not just pressure but a proposed restructuring of the entire island. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is reportedly leading the negotiations, using channels in Mexico to speak directly with high-level Cuban officials. The goal? A transition model where American companies would be allowed to operate in energy, tourism, and banking. In exchange, the 60-year embargo would be lifted, potentially saving the current leadership from a violent collapse. Insiders call it the Venezuela model, a system where existing officials stay in power but cooperate fully with U.S. energy and economic management. Washington is motivated by a massive fear. A total state collapse would trigger a migrant crisis larger than the 1980 Mariel boat lift. By preventing a collapse, the administration hopes to stabilize the region and stop the flow of tens of thousands across the straits. But the friendly part of the takeover is not guaranteed. Trump warned on March 9th that if a deal isn't reached, the takeover may be less than friendly. This has met fierce resistance in the U.S. Senate. Senators Tim Kaine and Ruben Gallego have filed a war powers resolution. They are fighting to prevent any unilateral military action, fearing the friendly takeover is a thin veil for direct intervention. Cuban leaders insist that any deal must respect their independence. But with the lights going out across the island, their leverage is disappearing. A deal would effectively bury the revolutionary paradigm in Latin America, countering the influence of the BRICS nations on America's doorstep. For the Trump administration, this is about more than just Cuba. It's about reclaiming U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. In Havana, the people wait, between the nostalgia of the revolution and the crushing reality of an empty ration book. The gates of the U.S. Embassy may soon see more than just diplomatic friction. They may see the influx of billions in reconstruction capital. Whether this leads to a Kubastroika, a structural shift to a market economy, or a collapse into chaos remains the critical question of 2026. For now, Cuba remains second on the president's list, with Iran taking priority, but the clock is ticking for the island. The shadow of Fidel Castro looms large, but his revolution is currently facing its ultimate test of survival. For the millions living in the dark, any deal, friendly or otherwise, represents a glimmer of hope in a decade of despair. We'll continue to track the developments in the Florida Straits. For Frontline USA, I'm your anchor. This is the conversation that's just beginning. Stay informed, support independent investigative reporting by subscribing to our newsletter. Good night.